I hope you found some inspiration from Brandon's story. I know I did, John.
I know I did.
Yeah, and we're switching gears now, talking about Parkinson's Awareness Month with physical therapist LeAnn Makela of Active Physical Therapy. So thank you so much for joining this conversation. We might be at the end of Parkinson's Awareness Month, but it's still a really important topic, disease to highlight. So thanks for being here. How does Parkinson's affect us here in the UP or broadly in the United States?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Parkinson's is such a big impact in healthcare and in people's lives. According to the Parkinson's Foundation, 90,000 people are diagnosed every year. So it's a huge disease that can really affect a lot of families. In the UP, there's not a lot of statistics very specific on numbers. It has been thought that maybe there's maybe a slightly higher prevalence in the UP, so that's why it's just so much more important to educate and talk about what signs and symptoms are and kind of how that can impact our community and making sure we have the right health care here.
I'm sorry. Okay. Well, speaking of signs and symptoms, how does Parkinson's affect the body?
Yeah, so Parkinson's, kind of on a small cellular level, it affects the neurons that produce dopamine. And dopamine affects and regulates a lot of our body processes. So it affects our movement. That's probably one of the more common things that people think of with Parkinson's. It can make your movement small and slow, a little bit more rigid, a little less coordinated. There's a lot of other non-motor symptoms like loss of smell. There's small handwriting, which kind of goes along with those things. So it really regulates a lot of the coordination in our body and really tells someone's body. It doesn't allow them to know how big they're moving. And so it's a lack of awareness, but not necessarily on a cognitive level. So people don't really know that they're moving smaller than what they did 5 years ago, which is why it can be tough. It can be a tough thing.
And so is this a neurological disorder?
Yeah, it's a neurological disorder. There's a lot of things, a lot of research that's poured in regarding to if there's genetic factors, environmental factors, it affects the brain. Some of those neurons in the middle of the brain, that's called the basal ganglia, it kind of breaks down the neurons that produce a hormone called dopamine. So it's not curable. There are ways to manage and treat it, but it isn't something that is curable, unfortunately, at this point.
And we will be looking into those ways to manage and treat, specifically what treatment looks like at Active Physical Therapy in our upcoming segment. But I'm curious to know more about the diagnosis. Is this something that, if somebody has Parkinson's disease, were they genetically predisposed to this, or is it something that lifestyle or environmental factors can influence?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's more commonly, I think people lean more towards environmental and genetics being kind of a mix as to how someone develops this disease. There are certain areas in the U.S. Where they can kind of hone in and say, well, gosh, this environmental factor we really feel has predisposed some people to Parkinson's. There are genetic factors as well. There's people who can be diagnosed prior to 50, which is considered early onset Parkinson's. And it's believed that a lot of those people maybe have a little bit more of a genetic predisposition to developing Parkinson's. So there's a lot that we don't know about because the brain is such a unique thing in everyone. So a lot of research is still needed to really truly understand and possibly help prevent or cure this disease. But at this point, there really isn't something for a cure. Still a lot of research to be known.
I know there's still lots of research to be done. There's still unknowns. But are there any commonalities when it comes to average age of diagnosis?
Yeah.
Or it affects men more than it affects women?
It is, yep. So it's more likely affects men. And typically, according to the research, people will be diagnosed like 60 and older. 50 and less is considered that early onset age range. But those are some commonalities in the disease that you can kind of see and suspect clinically if you're seeing someone and you start to notice symptoms of Parkinson's. It'll typically be in that 60 and higher age range.
We have a list of some of those common signs and symptoms that we can get on our screen. Take a look right there. And I have a feeling that you know, this might not affect everybody the same way. There might be a mix of these symptoms. Does it typically start with one thing and progress into others?
Yeah, the great question. Some of the more common, I guess, what you think is classic symptoms would be a tremor. That's probably one thing that's really obvious to people that they start to develop. It typically will happen in more commonly one hand. It can be a foot. And it's kind of a classic pill rolling tremor where the hand is kind of closed and it almost looks like you're rolling pills in your hand. That's why they call it that. So that's a really common thing. Another thing that is commonly found is people will start to kind of have a shuffled gait, or they'll start shuffling their feet when they're walking, a little bit more forward flexed in their posture, that again, they have little awareness of unless they look at themselves in a mirror. And then falls can be one of those things where they're not quite sure why they're falling, but they will just start falling. A masked face, so what that means is having kind of a lack of facial expression and not really realizing that they have a kind of a masked appearance in their face. It doesn't mean that people aren't experiencing emotion, they just have a harder time, you know, kind of expressing that through their facial actions.
Yeah.
So small handwriting too, that's another thing they'll kind of check clinically, is smaller and more maybe smaller and kind of garbled handwriting.
Yeah, well, LeAnn, this is a really important topic of conversation as Parkinson's Awareness Month continues. We're going to talk about what treatment looks like at active physical therapy and at what point you should maybe seek treatment if you think you have Parkinson's disease when we return.